Hello, this is Maria Savona. I'm a professor of Economics of Innovation at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And I will be presenting, my submission is number 102, and I will be presenting this working paper, quite recent working paper that I titled The Saga of COVID-19 Contact Tracing Apps. What lessons for data governance, if any? So basically, let me start by sharing the sort of genesis and caveats related to this work. I'm an economist and I'm a social scientist interested in data governance and from the perspective of data value as well. And more in general, I've been observing over the years the increasing use of digital technology for public purposes and all the issues related to value concentration and privacy and beyond. And while observing the unraveling of the saga of contact tracing apps, I observed that a lot of the main issues related to data governance came to the forefront. And I've tried to narrate this saga more than an academic paper as a sort of social observation from a social scientist. Now, the caveats of this work is that obviously the saga keeps unraveling every day, even now. So the challenge is to stylize the main facts and draw general conclusion or implication for data governance. Now, this is a great environment to share this because the reflection, a full reflection on data governance in this context would require a full bunch of expertises that go beyond economics, of course, privacy lawyers, privacy engineers, digital law, data science, and competition law. So all this is would be required to unpack the issues here. Now, let me start by pretty much detailing the calendar of the saga so far. First of all, just a line. I know that this is common knowledge, given that we all experienced the pandemics, the COVID pandemic's effect. The idea is to contain the spreading of the contagion by using this golden mix of testing, tracing, and isolating contacts of people with that turn out to be positive. So ideally, the use of contact tracing apps would be in principle useful to make it to reduce it in a much faster way than would be a manual contact tracing the spread of the pandemics. At the same time, this is de facto a surveillance tool that people are not mandated to, but warmly suggested to download on their devices. Now, this use of contact tracing apps in February, March, as I show here, was pretty normal, has been pretty normal and fully deployed in countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and so on, in the memory of previous pandemics related to coronaviruses. Now, in Western Europe, at the same time, the wave of pandemics arrived later on. And the first salient moment of this saga is this launch of the DP3T protocol. So a protocol, an international network of academics led by Carmela Troncoso and EPFL, have developed a sort of remarkably original protocol, decentralized, I'll come back to this later, to host contact tracing apps. Now, interestingly, a week later, Google and Apple launched a joint Android and iOS platforms to support the decentralized version of these contact tracing apps. In parallel, since March and April and continuously, European institutions have been relentlessly working on standardized guidelines and on the deployment of these digital tools, with a series of interesting outcomes, I must admit, that all devoted to maintain privacy and at the same time trying to speed up the deployment of digital tools to contain the pandemic. Now, in the UK, amidst a lot of very heated debate on this use of digital tools, one of the salient moments that I have identified is the UK Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights that produced a report titled The Human Rights and the Government Response to COVID-19 Digital Contact Tracing. I'll come back to this later. Meanwhile, in May, June, in some of the EU countries, the apps were actually launched and downloaded by, as far as I know, an average of 2% of the population over the first week since the launch. So not a striking percentage, given that the most effective one is at least 60% of the population downloading and using the apps. At the same time, these have, in some of these countries, encountered issues related to privacy. So in June, July, end of June maybe, mainly, some of these EU countries froze the use of these apps due to data protection issues. For example, in the Netherlands, in Lithuania, in Denmark, Germany. Currently in the UK, launch of these contact tracing apps, digital contact tracing apps, is postponed to the autumn after a pilot in the Isle of Wight that provided very unconvincing results. Now, this is more or less the sort of fast unraveling of the saga. What I'd like to share is a few issues related to, first of all, technical aspects and then legal aspects. And then I'll come to the economic aspects that I would like to unravel a little and to unpack a little bit more. So with the use of digital contact tracing apps, this is mainly, but not only, a privacy issues. And why do we know? I mean, privacy issues is the main ingredients to allow people to trust the institutions, requiring citizens to de facto install a surveillance tool on their devices. So ideally, what would be important here is to apply GDPR principles on the use of personal data that I recall it here: data minimization, purpose limitation, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, lawfulness, fairness and transparency, and accountability and accuracy. So ideally, while applying these principles, the point would be to assess the extent to which all of these principles are met when contact tracing apps are proposed, launched, and asked, and people are asked to adopt it. As I said, the main core debate was around use of decentralized versus centralized solutions. Now, for technically literate people like me, and I'm sure it's not the case for the audience of this conference, the famous DP3T, the Centralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Protocol, launched at the beginning of April, is ideally more privacy friendly, because people would download and release data on their location, health, and so on, that remain in their devices, whereas a centralized solution would imply sending this data to a central repository. That's the idea. So is not that black and white. In each of these solutions has pros and cons, but ideally in terms of privacy, obviously a decentralized solution, which is also the one that was suggested by at the European level, is preferred. Now, a third technical issue is, of course, interoperability. In this particular case, I won't go to the actual definition of interoperability. In this context, it means allowing people to have an app that is cross-border interoperable, which means that if people travel, then, for example, app users may rely on Google app that is functioning across borders. Now, this is something that has been warmly suggested at the European level. Now, with a directive from the European Data Protection Board. Now, it's not all about privacy. As I said, I mean, most of the issues related to the digital contact tracing apps relate to trust. And I'd like to highlight one particular issue that was included in this European Data Protection Board's guidelines released in March 2020, and that are related to basically consideration of compatible purposes for secondary use of the data collected, released through digital contact tracing. What does it mean? I mean, data for research purposes, for instance, can be of primary use or directly collected for the purpose of scientific studies, or of secondary use. So, for example, data that consists of further processing of data initially collected for other purposes. Now, in this particular case, the EDPB considered the data collected through contact tracing apps compatible, allowed the secondary use. So ideally, if the data this data is collected to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic, so simply for tracing the contacts of the contagious person, ideally this is compatible with the purpose of tracing symptoms and contacting the symptomatic individual. So ideally, one would expect that in the case of central repository of data released via digital contact tracing, ideally one can also use it for public research to further mitigate the effect of the pandemics. Now, in this case, it's interesting that the very preliminary studies, for example, the SIMCO that I'm quoting here, but I'm sure there will be more coming out, especially because this particular one was preliminary, was sharing preliminary results and based on unrepresentative samples of interviewees. People basically were more prone to release data through such platforms, apps, rather than trusting their government. For example, trusting that their government would delete the data at the end of the emergency. So in this particular study, 72% of people did not trust that their government would delete the data at the end of the emergency, or would use their data only for contact tracing purposes, although there was a level of expectation that data could be used for research purposes. It's quite interesting. The point that citizens wouldn't, even if the sort of public, even if there is a public purpose for the use of these data, people wouldn't trust their government. And this was interviewees across different European countries, so not only in the UK. Now, one particular salient moment of this saga is that I consider to be a sort of way of striking the right balance between techno-determinist and technophobic are people like, all the all the research carried out, all the blogs and communication carried out by the other institutes. The most remarkable at the time was the Rapid Evidence Review exit through the Apple Store, but also a professor like Robin Mansell at LSE Media and Communication that came up with observations related to the extent to which the government response was a proportionate one with respect to the use of contact tracing apps. So there were people, academics, NGOs, and so on, cautious with the idea of deploying such an invasive digital tool. And in fact, part of these issues was calling the government and the public, for an effective, accurate, and proportionate response. So ideally, the issue was considering this particular use of digital tools within the emergency. That was the main purpose. However, to maintain a proportionate response to the pandemics. So what was recommended, it was that the technical specifications should be in line with GDPR principles, that the adoption of these contact tracing apps should not be made mandatory, and therefore no one should be penalized for not adopting. And also what remained unresolved was the idea that over 20% of the people, for example, in the UK, are de facto digitally excluded from the adoption of these apps simply because they haven't got smartphone devices. And this particular percentage goes to a lot more, over 40% in the population over 65. So this was a huge drawback with this use of digital tools. So digital exclusion was a sort of deterrent or surely a barrier for the effective use of these apps. So the call was to support the development and deployment of these digital tools by safeguarding and within the context of human rights, rather than assessing them only within the realm of privacy rights. Now, and this was fundamental. There were fundamental voices in the midst of the saga, I must say, and this was remarkably important. I mentioned earlier that the Joint Committee on the Human Rights, which was informed by the Bill of Safeguards on the human rights, and this was in line with the principles of efficacy and proportionality. The idea was to protect this particular policy with primary legislation, so important in times of emergency. And among other issues, there was the recommendation to establish an independent technical advisory group of experts alongside the scientific advisory group of experts. The end of this particular saga moment was that the government did consider this recommendation, but not adopted it, arguing that the principle of the GDPR were sufficient to guarantee the privacy aspects of the story, and therefore that according to the government, the citizen and the public wouldn't be a risk of decreasing level of trust. All this remains to be seen, basically. Now, I would like then to delve a bit more into what I call the economic aspects. And this might sound to this audience as a sort of conspiracy theory, because as a matter of fact, the role of these actors like Google and Apple entering this particular landscape were not actually put under sufficient scrutiny, according to me. In other words, to the extent that there was a lot of discussion related, for example, to the fundamental aspect of human rights of this particular use of digital tools to tackle pandemics, the role of these large platforms hasn't been actually questioned or and so on. For the simple reason that since the very beginning, they saw that there would be, they launched their role as a full support to decentralized solution. And therefore, I see a sort of shielding or misleading public trust ways. You know, it remains pretty unquestioned for the simple reason that from the previous perspective, this was basically meeting all the requirements. Now, in my view, and then again, leaving aside any conspiracy theory related to this, but there is a lot of literature on what is called the symbolic rather than substantive corporate social responsibility, which means that large multinationals, large tech, and in this case, we had the digital barons, as came up from the hearing yesterday in the US. The idea here is not only privacy respect, and I mean privacy preserving, which the DP3T protocol is pretty much in line with, but is mainly more at large the idea that this platform, once they support these apps, will be sitting on an even larger and even more sensitive and even more valuable trove of personal data. Now, so in this context, there is not much but a central international regulation that can safeguard public trust against this, against these large platforms. Now, in this context, and I would like to basically, in this context, and I would like to get more into these economic aspects, and as an economist, I will have to go to the issues related to data value that I'm most interested in this respect, and that haven't been considered in this saga, is this idea that what can be drawn in terms of lessons for data governance, so of these particular issues. Now, what I feel like saying is that the blood boundaries between personal and non-personal data are difficult to identify and regulate. So even here, there's no anonymized or pseudo-anonymized personal data in this context, and therefore the issues at stake are particularly relevant. In this particular saga, trust and trustworthiness are key ingredients for this, and therefore the role of Google and Apple in this particular context has to be assessed against the level of trust of people. Now, what I think is that this saga of the COVID contact tracing apps has really fast forwarded all the missing bits of a functional data governance. The lack of trust, the lack of proportionality, the lack of efficacy, the lack of coordination in handling personal and non-personal data, the sort of overlook and serious overlook of issues related to digital exclusion and fairness. But mainly what I think is that what this saga has really exposed in the context of data governance and in general in terms of data policy is that a serious reflection on the economic aspect of data governance is actually missing. And this is where I sort of take responsibility in terms of, as a social scientist, interest in data value. So in this respect, and very briefly, what I think it's important to include in this particular context is consideration of where the current state of affairs is on a highly concentrated market structure of large platforms that actually create barriers to data access. And also, for example, one of the side effects is suboptimal quality of data of machine learning and AI diffusion. In this particular context, what is important from the research perspective is to unpack the economics of data value. And by value, I would like to highlight that I'm not talking simply about market value. I'm talking about value in general, including public value, and trying to understand how the data value chain is to be unpacked in this particular context. So to me, for example, designing an effective models of data governance cannot really be, about this main ingredient. And again, the issues of the saga of these contact tracing apps has really shown that the main actors in the end are large platforms. So very briefly, I think that what it would be important to basically unpack and taking responsibility as economists is understanding that in the context of data value and in the context of data governance, economists have really done too little and too late to predict the massive concentration of data value in these large platforms. More than that, and again, I take responsibility also as economists related, interested in the economics of intangible investment. Economists of intangibles have de facto legitimated the True. I mean, I think it's important. There's a huge research gap in this context that should be understanding the complex political economy aspects of data value concentration. And what I mean by this is trying to understand, consider issues of privacy, issues of data ownership, issues of behavioral and political manipulation, issues related to the opaque business models that these platforms have in this context. So the challenge here is trying to understand what kind of institutional architecture should be devised to a functional data governance, to achieve a functional data governance. Now, I think I'm done. So what I've been writing so far, and let me just jump to this particular issue. So this is links up, this is taken from Geoff Mulgan and Nesta, a column from, I think, last year that was presented here at SPRO as well. If we look at the current landscape of data governance and we try to understand the different types of data, and trying to visualize on aspects that are related, on the one hand, to complete control of data versus a total compulsory or unavoidable sharing, and contrast this with the actual value of this data, then we can figure out and we can position, for example, the importance of public value when it comes to health data, mobility data, administrative records, or national security sensitive data, and so on. And ideally, we should be repackaging or reframing the whole landscape for data governance along these lines. So there is data with little value, there is data with huge value. There is data that people are totally in control of, and there is data that people, that is unavoidable to share. So the idea in this particular case is trying to reframe the data governance, again from the issue of what we put forward in this Nesta blog, which I elaborate a little bit on, is the idea of having sort of central public data trust that basically function as a public intermediaries between individuals, like in the case of the contact tracing apps that release health data and location data, super sensitive data, to this public data trust that can then be used for a public purpose. At the same time, people must be free to, for example, have their personal data stored in personal data store or industry-specific trust when it comes to value that is not particularly important for public purposes. So ideally, the main points here are to recognize the specific data we're talking about, the specific role of trust in these particular issues, and this is trust as a key ingredient, but also trust as a legal device to be included in the discussion. Note that what I'm talking about is parallel, possibly non-exhaustively related to bottom-up data trust, for example, put forward by Sylvie Delacroix and Nick Lawrence. In this particular case, what I think I'm advocating is a sort of central regulator that can act as a trust. And ideally, and this is again very preliminary and very experimental, the idea is to start from seminal regulation like the GDPR, but not only limited to this, and trying to allow for to build up on this, that has de facto given an unprecedented agency to individuals to consent, deny, or limit the use of their data, and also choose the recipient of their data. And ideally start with a supranational European data trust that, as I said, shouldn't be mutually exclusive with the small-scale experiments of data commons. The way I see it is a particularly complementary architecture with small local experiments with a central regulators that act as a data trust. Now, all this is obviously has to be implemented by law expertise, which it's important to have as well. But ideally, I think what I would like to advocate in this context, before this is even analyzed and discussed with the relevant expertise, is just trying to revisit the narratives around data rights, data economic justice, and data ownership. And what I've noticed, even within the saga of the contact tracing apps, the way I call it, is a lot of this debate becomes a hostage of ideological slogans. So more research is needed, and most of all, multidisciplinary research is needed. And the reason why I consider the contact tracing apps as an illuminating example is that it has really put forward all the issues related to the use of digital tools for public purposes. So I'll stop here. Thanks for listening.